My name's Debra McDougall. I'm a senior lecturer in anthropology at the University of Melbourne, and I'm going to talk for a few minutes before turning to a conversation with Alpheaus Zobule, the founder and director of the Kulu Language Institute of Ranongga in the Solomon Islands. Our focus in the conversation is the value of resources in and about Indigenous languages to Solomon Islanders, and we describe ongoing locally driven work of documenting, analyzing, and understanding local languages. So the Kulu Institute is named for two closely related languages of the island: Kumakota, spoken in the northern half, and Lunga, spoken in the southern half, both with about 3,500 speakers. Kulu, as Ranongga people call the Kulu Language Institute, began in about 1998-99 when Alpheaus Zobule, then a Bible translator, realized that people were not necessarily able to read the Lunga translation he was working on. What began as small workshops on grammar has grown into a really thriving and beautiful campus at a place called Giloy. Zobule developed a new grammatical meta-language using familiar Lunga words for linking, branching, cutting, navigating in order to describe the structure and function of the language. It's really remarkable for being a monolingual description of the language. In the early days, people were mocked for studying their own language instead of English. By the mid-2010s, however, hundreds of young people had begun flocking to the school to study Lunga, specifically grammar. In 2017, I began doing interviews to find out what was driving them. A key point was that it gave them a sense of being anchored in firm ground in an intellectual sense. So here's a list of some places you can learn a bit more about the Kulu Institute, the philosophy and the development of Kulu, especially Zobule's 2018 public lecture at Kodal. And we also have a website. So in 2019, a Solomon Islands language workshop was held in Honiara. It was sponsored by Kodal and university partners and hosted by the Kulu Language Institute and Alpheaus Islands Bible Ministry, which is based in Honiara and brings people from across the country together. It really tapped into local interest in language beyond Ranongga. We'd hoped for about 30 participants and got more than 100 from 44 of the Solomon Islands, 70 some languages. It really helped to connect Solomon Islanders to experts in Australia and in the region, gave them hands-on work that accessed their broad and deep knowledge of their own languages. And it highlighted the work of the Kulu Language Institute as an example of what might be done on a grassroots level. Zobule and I are also co-investigators on an ELDP legacy materials grants, which has enabled the digitization of more than 100 hours of cassette recordings from the mid-1980s to the early 2000s. One set was recorded in the 80s by the gentleman in the blue here, Kenneth Roga, another by an Australian researcher, Lawrence Stubbs, and another set by myself. So part of this has been training the Kulu staff to work with the transcriptions and to do some documentation of their own. And that was a focus of a roundtable discussion held at the Kulu Language Institute in September 2019, a few days of workshop prompted by the digitization of old resources. A lot of people were interested in talking about the possibility of recording new materials for future generations.
There are a couple of reasons. The first is just because there was really nothing in the language, nothing written in the language. And so when we started producing materials for them to read, there was really an obvious need to have materials, text materials. and there was none. But we needed a text that were not just made up by me or anybody else who was there writing the material with me. So we decided to take natural texts of the ones that were written by the students. So that was it. There's part of the way that we could produce materials is to just use whatever they produced at the workshops or when we gather to study the language. Now, the second is that I think it helped people to see that they could actually produce something, and it gave them the sense that they were important, that whatever they produced was not just something that was useless, but that others who would come after would benefit from them. So it kind of gave them an excitement too. People would go to the book and say, "Oh, that's my story. That's my story." And so it also generated a lot of interest from others coming to study, as well as from those who actually wrote, contributed the stories or the text. So the food for thought, every chapter has a food for thought at the end of the chapter. And it's usually about something about that somehow connects to the grammatical concept that is studied in the chapter. But also there is another consideration. Many times, I think when students came, they thought of the grammar study as something very technical. And so it's more like trying to demonstrate to them that it can be fun and also relevant to the life situations that we're in. And so the food for thought somehow takes those grammatical concepts, sometimes very difficult ones, and sort of turns them into stories that relate to very normal kind of lifestyle. And usually there are lessons and values that can be learned from the food for thought and be applied to daily living. So I think that's the kind of idea. And actually, I was a little surprised myself that people really love those. But I think it's because they find it so relevant. These are hidden treasures. Um, Many of the people who were recorded have passed on. They are no longer around. And just to hear them speak and talk about the things that they talked about, um, I consider them as hidden treasures, and somehow they need to be accessible by the speakers themselves, so that they can listen to them or read or even go over them. Because I think a lot of those, they talk about how, respect, for example, or how people lived back then, which can still be applicable to how we live today. So there are lessons and values to be learned from the stories. So yes, I think for Kulu Language Institute, these materials, if they are made available to us, we could actually somehow uh, make them as part of materials that students can read and study and use them as basis to talk about issues and values and things that relate to life. So I think there is a potential. Having stories or things like that on record somehow raises their importance, and people value those. And so going around and recording stories somehow makes people realize that whatever they talk about to them might not be, they may used to think as not so important, but now recording it makes them realize that these are actually important. And I think there is the realization that you know like Kulu, Lunga, and Kumbokora is really even up until this point, um, it's not a written culture. Uh, Much of it is still passed down through oral traditions, and so uh, just having them on record makes people realize that they can be transmitted and passed on. At this point, when there is nothing on record, when a person dies, that's the whole library that is that ends right there. When a person is buried, that's a library's burned, because all the knowledge that that person knows or carries with him or her, it cannot be recovered. And so having things on record, I think, is the way the materials can be used again in the future, and it can be passed on to the generations in the future. Yeah, so I studied the Bible, and I translate the Bible, and I preach from it too. And but then at the same time, I am someone who comes from the Lunga area, Kulu area, and studying the word and the language and trying to make sense of all that. And I think the first thing to say is that the Bible is a foreign book. It doesn't come from the Kulu area. So whatever is written there, much of it is foreign. Although we can still identify things that are similar. We're in the same world, so we don't expect things to be completely different. But in general, we can say it comes from a different place, different culture, and so the meanings are not always the same as what we know. I think I've realized that many times when we preach directly from the Bible and coming up with values taken from the Bible, that is good, but there is a sense that, a lot of values we already have. They're right there. We know what respect is. We know how to share with other people. We know how to treat other people. And this can be taken just from the culture, the Kulu culture. And so I think for me, when you want to learn another value system, it's always best to start with your own, to understand it. So, when we do not give enough time, sufficient time to think about our own, and then we jump across to another value system and try to learn it, we just, in some sense, we are floating right there. In order to be grounded in our own value system, I think we need to be looking at our own first, so that when we look at another, we can at least judge and say, okay, this is similar to ours. This is the way we do it. And we can either adopt or adapt when we get another value system. But I think that's the whole point of it, as I think about it. So I do not reject our own value system. I think that's where we start. And then we move on to understand. And then we can take on the Bible or what other books important to us and look at them. And another thing to say is that when we study our own value system, I think we can appreciate it. We know what it is. We are in the culture. We can understand better. We can talk about it. And then that gives us the basis to talk about another system, maybe another value system. So we need to be grounded in our own first before we start talking about another system. I guess that's the point I was trying to make.
And that's exactly the same point you make about the study of language, that you have to be grounded in your own, and then you go to another and you can move between them.
Exactly. It's the same thing maybe said. And when it comes to language, like other things, English, for example, I teach English, so I have nothing bad to say about English. It's very good. But in learning languages, we want to start from the known language and then move on to the unknown. We are new to this at this point, but we are not new to the languages. We more and more we realize the importance of the languages, but we also realize that more needs to be done to document the languages. So we thank you. We're moving into this with a lot of excitement, but with a lot of need for guidance and maybe training in how to do all this. But I think there is a lot of excitement when it comes to language documentation. Thank you.